I am the father of a very extremely disabled child who has both mental retardation and autism and is self-injurious. And we've struggled for over 50 years with having a child in our family. We have 2 children, fortunately, who are perfectly normal and very successful in their lives, but we as a family had a challenge for many years. And so it's a continuing, you never stop being the parent of a child who has these disabilities. It's with you your entire life. And so it is even now. And so I know that you all, many of you have had those same experiences. So I am really thrilled to hear what people have to say about how they have approached this problem, whether the disabilities are extreme or more moderate. So with that opening comment, just to let you know my heart is in this conversation, I'll turn it over to our panelists. And the panelists, we have 3 panelists. Yitz Frank, do I have that?
Frank.
Yep. Yitz Frank with School Choice in Ohio. We have Karla Phillips-Krivickas. Yeah. Karla is from the Arizona State Board of Education. And we have Cher Harris from Autism Inspired Academy, right? So we'll start with Yitz. Yep.
Well, thank you for having me, Paul. So I don't know if you'll learn as much from my presentation as you'll probably learn from my co-panelists, but I think I just wanted to start off by maybe just a brief introduction to the work that we do, just so you have some context for what I'm going to say. But I've been an advocate both representing non-public schools, and then more recently I chair our statewide organization called School Choice Ohio. And obviously we are proponents of school choice and private school choice, but really all choices and options. And we work with 20,000 different families in a typical year, trying to find the right fit for their child, irrespective of sector. We do have universal school choice in Ohio, so families really do, assuming that there are options available in their area. They do have access to all of those options. We have universal open enrollment, public school open enrollment, charter schools, and scholarships. One of the programs that we passed many years ago, one of the first school choice programs that we passed at scale was our special needs scholarship program. And one of the, it has had challenges, but it also has created tremendous opportunities. The number of students that are enrolled in that particular scholarship program has increased by 30% from COVID. So I think what we've been seeing in at least in our state is that parents have, particularly, we've seen growth in school choice options, period. But many of those, at least in Ohio, was, I think, prompted by policy changes that enabled more families to have those options. There were no policy changes that happened to our special needs scholarship program, but parents have obviously felt the need to explore other options and have been able to do that through that program. So when we passed our program, and this was a big fight both in the legislature and then when we adopted our rules, I think that there's a lot of emphasis in the sector right now on the ability for parents to tailor-make programs and choose multiple options and choose any kind of environment that they think is best for their child, whether it's a home environment or school-based or center-based, whatever it is. When we implemented our program about 15 years ago, we actually allowed for that. Many programs that was not in the country that were created was not exactly like that, but we really structured our scholarship program in a way that parents can tailor make any kind of program for their child. They can have 30 different providers. They could have one provider. It could be a school. And so I think that has allowed and so we've seen an uptick in that usage, and hopefully that will continue to grow. One of the things that I'm seeing most right now is, I think one of the mistakes that we've made, and which I'd like to correct, is that there's so much of the resources that we supply to students with learning differences and special needs are really wrapped up so closely in IDEA and various laws. I think some of that was a mistake. It becomes very, very difficult, I think, for parents, and I think providers are spending a lot of time with parents just going through the IEP process. I don't think that the district is the best home for that. I think there are probably other ways to do that, and states probably should be smarter about just piggybacking off of federal law, which, in many cases works well, but there are a lot of flaws in it. And if they don't have to connect to that, that's just, at least in my experience. So I guess that's my opening.
All right, thank you. So, Chair.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Cher Harris, and I'm co-founder and head of school of Autism Inspired Academy. We are in Clearwater, Florida. We are in our 5th school year. We have 115 students, and we just expanded to a new location where we plan to grow out to our capacity of about 170 students. We are a school specifically for children with autism. You have to have a diagnosis of autism or an IEP that states that you're best served in an autism classroom from the district. Some of our students do have co-occurring disorders such as ADHD, anxiety, sensory processing, but they do have to have that diagnosis of autism. Our model embeds social skills and behavior strategies into our everyday. Into our academic program, our curriculum, our lessons. We spend the first quarter of every school year explicitly teaching social skills and using a behavior program in the classrooms that helps teach self-regulation and emotional regulation to help our students succeed. In our academic program, everything is done in individualized small groups. So we look at assessments and observations in our data and then break them up into small groups in order to help them access the curriculum. One of the things that I have found to be the most successful is that we have our own behavior department, and that department does teaching and trainings and resources for our classroom management for our classrooms, but they also help manage all of the outside therapy companies that we allow to come into our school. So we have a lot of our students, about 25% of them receive applied behavioral analysis therapy on our campus throughout the school day. And so we work with those therapy companies to make sure that they are following our policies and procedures that we have set forth for our own staff, even though they're non-employees, and then also to make sure that they're aligned to our mission of empowering children with autism to have lives of meaning, purpose, and joy. And so my business partner, Liz Russell, and I, we developed this school because we just saw a lack of continuity through the classrooms in the public school systems where I was teaching. We also saw a deficit in helping parents access resources in the community, and sort of we wanted to have this one-stop shop where they could come in and they could really get a quality education where, yes, the students are loved and they are comfortable, but that should not be our standard for students with special needs. They should be thriving and they should be able to grow up and be members of the society, of the community that can give back in some way. We know that looks different for every child, regardless of if they have a special needs or not. And so with our program, we offer pathway programs. We have programs that are modified for learners that may go into more of a supported living situation. They may need a job coach and go into work-based study programs through the vocational rehabilitation program. But we also have students that are dual enrolled with Florida virtual school classes that are doing continuing education credits in order to earn a technical type of certification. And we have students that are dual enrolled with University of South Florida. And so they are earning degrees while they are at our school in our high school. And so that's something that we work really hard to make sure that we are that we're helping the parents navigate the resources that are out there and then bringing them all into the school. So when they come to our school, they can get these therapies, whether it's language, OT, ABA, they can partner with vocational rehabilitation and not be on a 2-year wait list in order to get help and services for their child. So we are currently, like I said, expanding our capacity and moving and growing. We just started a small business called Inspired Farming, where our students are learning to care for farm animals. We're growing vegetables and fruit, and we're actually taking it to market and having them learn how to sell, and we're doing that in our modified classrooms. In some of our elementary classrooms, we're actually hatching the chickens and things like that. So we're definitely expanding and working on new programs to help them get out into the community and use all of these skills and strategies that we are teaching them and generalize them out into the public so that they can grow up to be functioning members of society that give back to our community.
All right, well, thank you very much. Karla.
Good morning. I'm Karla Phillips-Krivickas. As he said, I'm a member of the Arizona State Board. I've been involved in the ed reform movement for a couple decades and a school choice advocate, but I'm also a mom of a son with ADD and a daughter with both Down syndrome and autism. And now I just funnel all my professional energies into advocating for students with disabilities, which is kind of one of the first things I want to challenge. Is I'm never really sure I know what the term special needs means. And that's because I personally believe that every child is unique and has a special need. So for the purposes of my comments, especially because they're always policy-based, because I'm kind of a policy wonk, I'm using the term students with disabilities as defined by federal law, fully recognizing the disadvantages that sometimes comes with that Yitz referenced. But really, I want to challenge the premise of this entire session and the question that we're looking at. Because the premise is that students with disabilities need different models. Some may, but most don't. By definition, if a student has a disability, has an IEP, by definition, that means they need some form of specially designed instruction or accommodation to access their curriculum. That's the definition, which means that it doesn't matter what the model is. They're going to need supports to access it. A really obvious example to me is a child with a visual impairment who may be completely blind. Doesn't matter if it's Montessori, classical, high school, elementary school, they're going to need some type of support to access the curriculum. So I want to challenge us to ask maybe a different question today. How can we design new models that are accessible to all kids? Which I think is a very fundamental difference. And it's so exciting to be at this conference because all we're hearing from are people who are being innovative, maximizing the flexibility they have in law to design new things. So what if we could design programs that are just more accessible? Here's a kind of picture-perfect example. Some of you may have seen this picture before. So it's the traditional wall in front of these kids, and those are the traditional models. And again, it doesn't matter if it's Montessori or classical. I'm kind of using two totally opposite ones as an example. It's not accessible to the young man on the right. So what do we traditionally do? We provide accommodations, which is great, and that's what the law says. But let's be honest, what we do is we single kids out often, which is sometimes why they don't even want them, especially when they get to college, which is a whole different debate. But they don't want them, and it also sometimes gives the impression that we're giving special treatment to some kids, and the kids don't always understand that. But here's why, is because in that traditional model, and I'm going to channel my inner Todd Rose for a second, if you guys know who that is, we're designing every model, textbook, curriculum for the traditional mythical average student. So when these models are designed, at the end we go, oh crap, what are we going to do with those kids? Those kids may be students with disabilities, they may be English language learners, they may be gifted and talented. It's those kids. So what if we were to design the new models you can see on the other side that are just accessible to all kids? They're universally designed at the very outset. I'm convinced that the reason we have some of these dilemmas, besides the idea of these mythical average kids, right, is because we still have really outdated perceptions of who's in special ed. And first of all, I don't even like that term because special ed isn't a place, right? The kids who are receiving special education student services and supports, these are the kids, right? There's always a cute girl with Down syndrome, which, my daughter's one of those girls. But think about even the images that we use on reports and websites. These are it. But the problem is there's severe policy implications to these perceptions. One, which you'll see in a second, they actually are a very small percentage of the kids receiving special ed services. But if these are who you think special ed looks like, you think it's really, really hard, you think it's really, really expensive, and you have, unfortunately, really low academic expectations. This is what most kids in special ed look like. And again, I know this in special ed isn't appropriate, but I'm just going to say it. This is what they usually look like, right? They're the kids that are frustrated, bored, falling asleep, acting out because they can't read, they can't access the curriculum, whatever those reasons are. And this is the majority of kids. This is what I also sometimes say, with his permission, I now have allowed to say, you're thinking about my daughter and not my son. That was my son, who I didn't figure out needed that help till he was a senior in high school. And look, I still get teary-eyed. It's still like my greatest parent regret. Because he was achieving super high, but had no idea how much he was struggling, because it's an invisible disability. Here's some federal data for you. I'm not going to make you squint, but you can see the three biggest pieces at the bottom. The piece on the right, 34.5% of kids have a specific learning disability. This is where dyslexia, dyscalculia would fall under. The second biggest bucket is other health impairment, which again, not obvious, but that's where ADHD would fall in that bucket, and then speech-language impairment. If you total those up, that's 70%. 70% of the kids receiving special ed services and supports have what I call invisible disabilities. They're in every classroom in America, by the way, often undiagnosed and underserved, like my son. They're in every classroom. But you can see the ones in those original pictures are a very small percent. So most experts would tell you that only maximum 10 to 15% of kids in special ed have a cognitive impairment, which my daughter falls in that category. But that means, flip that number, 85 to 90% of kids in special ed should be achieving on par with their peers if they're getting what they need. And I want to make a plug for a new nonprofit that I have started. And the reason is because for me, it's my school choice fight come full circle. So in Arizona, we are fortunate. As you all know, we have just about every form of school choice, I think, that exists. We've pioneered most of it. But we now are faced with a capacity problem. So what I learned very quickly is that most faith-based private schools want to serve more kids with disabilities. They have no idea how. So this is the kind of organization that, quite frankly, I think every state that's interested in special ed, in school choice needs to think about. How can we find ways to provide, we're fundraising to provide free professional technical assistance and professional development to any faith-based school that's ready and willing to serve kids with disabilities.
All right, so 3 great presentations. I have about an hour's worth of questions, but I will restrain myself and let you ask some questions for me. Somebody's standing over here. Yeah.
Thank you all for your work. I come from Wisconsin, and our private school has one of the top 10 largest programs serving students with disabilities. And one of the things we're finding quite often, and I'm just wondering on your perspective on this, is the red tape from the state to receiving funding. We accept just about every type of student, every type of disability. It's part of our core values as a religious school. But particularly with our students with more significant needs, there is a mechanism in the state for, they call it actual costs. So our program is also called SNSP. But there's an application to apply for additional funding for those students who have significant needs, of which we have some. Year after year after year, the audit comes back and we get denied and denied. And it is because the auditor is asking for minute-by-minute breakdowns from our staff and explanations for every tool and every allocated minute, payroll records for the whole year. The list goes on and on and on, and the amount of manpower and hours it takes to deliver. After 3 years, we finally got funding for one of our highest need students this year, so it was a miracle. But my question to you is, given the amount of red tape, and this is just Wisconsin's story from our school, how do we advocate? I love that you created a network. I think that's awesome. There are a few of those in Wisconsin, but what can school leaders like me or others, what can we do? What is the right angle of, I don't want to say an angle of attack because that sounds bad, but what's our approach to minimizing that red tape with the state when it comes to funding? And what's the smart play here to make it less us versus them and just about getting funding to the kids? Thank you.
Well, I'll go first. I actually happen to have a nephew in Milwaukee that is actually on one of those scholarships, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I think that it's a little bit challenging, right? Because on the one hand, these kids, we especially if we're spending public money, any money, right? But like my co-panelist said, like a lot of parents might be a little out of their depth here. A lot of schools are out of their depth here, right? And so there obviously is a strong interest in making sure that the services that at least you say you're going to provide are being provided. But on the other hand, I think that what's critical both for these programs and also for schools is that not every school is going to be able to provide the entire gamut of services that these kids may need, or what the IEP says they need. But the truth is that most of them are not getting that in public schools either. They're just entitled to it, right? And so, to me, and the most important thing that you can put in place as a practice, but also as a policy, is that the more involved the parents are in knowing what's going on, the better it is. It's very possible a lot of these parents are opting out of the public school system for a reason. Many schools, private schools and otherwise, they're not necessarily offering to implement the entire IEP, but they'll work with the parents to make sure that they'll have a plan. So our program in Ohio, sort of the way it works is that the parents really are kind of given the money. I mean, they're not given dollars, but they are given authority to release the money from the Department of Education. So there's a little bit of a check on the provider that, like, the parent is basically saying, yeah, this happened, they provided this, and you would assume that the parent's happy, otherwise they might decline to release the money. And so it sort of helps minimize the amount of involvement that the state itself has to be involved there. So that might be a suggestion. I think that before you change the law, you're probably going to need to wait for a new governor. That's just me saying that. But I think having clear expectations and making sure that you as a school and other providers are completely aligned with the parents. You don't have to do everything that everybody wants, but the parents and the school really need to be on the same page. And you could put policy in place, and that might help convince legislators to modify some of those things. So.
Okay.
I'm not completely sure if I understood your question is it a school choice scholarship type program? Okay, because I was going to, under IDEA, every state has an extraordinary fund that you can work with your State Department to tweak the rules are, which I've been a strong proponent of, because going back to my numbers and my perceptions, the outliers often become the topic of discussion. Like, it doesn't even matter if we're talking about reading. Oh, but what about those kids? I'm like, okay, those are the outliers. Let's talk to me why 34.5% of kids with specific learning disabilities aren't reading, right? So I'm a strong advocate for trying to figure out how to fund the outliers, because they are really expensive, especially when you're talking about rural Arizona. If you're in a rural area and you get that one kid, they don't have the economies of scale and all that stuff. So I would also look at your IDEA application for your state, because there's formulas in there that usually the State Department kind of submits to the feds, sometimes without input from the field. on how that money gets allocated.
Okay, another question. Yes, sir.
I've had two daughters with learning disabilities, but there's a book out from one of the Harvard School of Education that there are 9 different forms of smarts. And only 3 or 4 of those actually apply to the traditional school in sitting down, studying, understanding, memorizing, etc. The other 4 or 5 smarts are really for different types of learning. With my 2 daughters, they both found it wasn't their ability, and I know we're talking autism and things, but I'm talking about traditional learning. Is there a change in the way not only public schools, but educational schools are teaching to teach to the kids who have learning abilities in other areas which they're really good in, such as the entrepreneurial skill that they excel in, but they're really bad in reading or something else, and they prove to be special needs in one area, but extremely intelligent in another? Is there some sort of shift that you see going on, and where is it, and who's doing it?
So I would say specifically in our area, I have not seen that shift occurring for the type of students that we educate at our school. I would say a lot of the students that we get into our school are exactly like that, even though they have autism and may have some other factors that come into play, but they, generally speaking, have some splinter skills or strengths in some areas that if you can get through some of the behaviors and some of the social skill deficits that they have, you're able to see those strengths in those areas and then really focus on them using those strengths in order to excel them to the next level. And then finding those interests that they have in order to close the gaps in what generally is reading comprehension, vocabulary, communication skills. That's something when I worked in the public school system, I tried really hard to advocate for those different styles of learning in the classroom to help students be able to close gaps and really focus on those skills that they did have. My son had severe ADHD, and we happened to find a very amazing magnet school that focused on computer programming and web development that he did a 4-year program in, and by the time he left, he had certifications that he could walk into Microsoft or Google and make 6 figures starting right after high school. So I think it's very important. I haven't seen it happening a lot, but I'm definitely an advocate for that, and I think it's very important to recognize that our students are learning differently, and as we increase all of the technology and their access to technology, that we have to make that shift as well in the classroom to make sure that we're accessing or helping students access all of the education they need in those strengths as well.
I used to be the senior policy director for a nonprofit called Knowledge Works that was really working on kind of spreading personalized competency-based learning across the country. My last project for them was I came to them and said, okay, we're working in all these schools. How is this idea changing special ed? And I interviewed, I believe, about 10 schools. I would tell you it was the most encouraging thing I saw. Because in theory, personalized learning is special ed done well and done right for all kids. And what I saw in these schools was that wall between gen ed and sped was gone. It was about how do we meet the needs of all kids. Now that seems overwhelming, but let me give you some really, I like to use like preschool, kindergarten type examples. I'm not a teacher, right? Like, so example is when my daughter was in like 2nd grade and they're doing spelling quizzes all the time, right? This one teacher did something so simple. They got to choose how they wanted to spell the words. Did they want to write them on the board? Did they want to do it verbally? Did they want to use letter blocks? Did they want to use the computer? Those little things make a big difference in these younger grades. But oftentimes the accommodations that kids need work for all kids. I mean, personally, I don't think anybody should have to have a disability to need more time to demonstrate mastery. If you don't know it, you don't know it. It doesn't matter if you have 4 hours to do it. And especially when you think about the kids with severe ADHD, like my son as well. I'm going to give you another really fun example. So she was in preschool, and of course she was having some fine motor skill issues, and they're working on coloring. She was in our church preschool, so she was the only kid with a disability. And then I found some mom article about triangle crayons. So I bought a box of triangle crayons. Sure enough, right? Now she's like, what? Well, I didn't want her to stand out. Crayons aren't too expensive, so I literally bought like a monster box of triangle crayons for the entire preschool, all the grades. Every teacher was blown away at how much their skills improved. So I use those as really easy examples of how there are easy ways that you can, one, the accommodations can help all kids, and two, how sometimes just giving the flexibility on how to demonstrate what they've learned. So it's not just about their learning style, how they want to take in the information, it's really about giving them flexibility in how they want to demonstrate that mastery.
Okay, now I see some hands. Yes.
I'd like you all to talk a little bit about the parents. We're talking about children and how we can accommodate for children, but I would like you all to talk a little bit about how can we educate the parents that a diagnosis is not a destination, it's just part of a journey. So how do we encourage the conversation so that it includes the parents, so the parents think in possibilities, not limiting parameters? Thank you.
So I think in the first few months, it's really hard to have that conversation with parents because they're so used to having to pick up their child from school early because they got a phone call that the teacher couldn't handle their behaviors. So we usually give, when I meet with every parent that enrolls in our school, I always tell them we're going to give you 3 months just to sort of work through that PTSD of wherever you've been previous to us. And then after that, we're going to band together to really show you what we've accomplished in the last 3 months of being in an environment that's right for your child. So we will bring them in and do observations, let them see what's happening in the classroom. We show them everything that their child's producing. And then we start to bring them in and, we do trainings in groups. I don't want to say support groups because that turns into a very negative conversation and situation. But we bring them in and train them on our behavior programs and our social skill programs that we're using in the classroom so they can use that same language at home, so they can go out into community and use that same language. And then we start to partner them with resources that we've built in the community. So we have some different resources we built, not just with therapies, but with psychiatrists and psychologists, with social groups, with different occupational therapists that are doing Special Olympics and Challenger baseball, and just ways for them to get out in the community and access some of those resources. But I think the trainings are essential because that's showing them how they can generalize those skills at home. And I tell every parent, we will never say, your child's not toilet trained, you need to go toilet train your child. We will help toilet train your child, and then we will show you how we did it, and we will guide you through that process, and we'll continue to have those meetings to help you accomplish that at home. But we kind of show them how we've done it first and that it is possible. Once they see it's possible, then they start to really open up the idea of anything is possible. And we have students who I've followed since I taught them in kindergarten in the public school system, and now they're in 10th and 11th grade. But we have students that in the beginning, behaviors were all we worked through for the first 6 months, and now they're dual enrolled in university courses, and their parents thought they would never live alone. And so I think once they start to see that they are making those gains, and they see everything that they're accomplishing, and they're making peer relationships, and they're connecting with other students, then it's much easier to have that conversation and to show them that they are absolutely capable of doing so much more, and they just need people to believe in them, and they need to be done in an environment that's right for them.
I agree with everything Cher said, but I think one of the things, I think there's like 2 major factors in at least in the question that you were asking, right? One is stigma. Stigma is a real thing. Just by virtue of the question, right? We're probably not talking about a child that's obviously impaired or disabled, because then the parents know we need to get help, right? It's about figuring out like, I never dreamed my child would have this problem. I didn't realize it. Is it even true, right? But then the other part is like, there's like a competency component to this too. Like, how competent is the school at communicating and identifying these things? How competent is the parent? Parents are in charge of their kids, but we all know parents that excel in different ways, and that's really, really hard, right? So one of the things that which is it's really expensive, but I think as AI improves, it's going to get easier to do. Is really like every child should have an IEP, right? Every child is different, and so like if that can become the norm and people can decide at what age that should happen, like that will combat both the stigma because everyone's getting an IEP. This child might need a super gifted instruction. Why can't we find that out as early as science allows us to, right? And sometimes there are special educational needs as defined by federal law that need to be accounted for too, right? So like I think that's really I think that's where the whole sector, not just special education, but really all education is getting more and more specialized, and I think technology will only improve that and might happen a lot faster than we know what to do with. I mean, and the other part of that is like at some point people are going to need to rethink like what is it that our kids need to learn in school, right? Like that gets back to like the previous question. Probably when we were all kids, when most of us were kids, you probably wrote reports on paper. How many kids today you think are writing a report on paper? In 10 years, is anyone even going to write at all? Or are they just going to communicate with AI? Like, so there's a lot of specialization that's going to occur. And I think if policymakers and really entrepreneurs are mindful about it, I think we could just see an incredible ability to specialize in a way that really can account for every single child's individuality. So,
Yes?
So as we're looking at how
I'm
these,
sorry, can I
Yeah.
address that last question? I'm sorry. I don't think parents need that help. The world needs to change. It is absolutely exhausting to advocate for your child 24 hours a day. It's the world. I think I have the highest expectations of most parents do, and I'm exhausted, and I cry at least once a week. Whether it's the woman at the grocery store who looks at my teenage daughter and says, oh, can she have a piece of candy? Like she can't talk for herself. Like I didn't know that all the teachers in my son's high school assumed that he was goofing off and not paying attention because they didn't know he had ADD. And then I find out that's why they weren't recommending him for, I mean, it's all day. It's whether you go to the doctor's office, oh, well, you know kids like this. Or you go to the dance school, oh, I'm sorry, we can't serve kids like that. It is all day. So I'm going to defend parents. I don't think parents need more help. I mean, they do, but you know. It's the world. We are fighting the world 24 hours a day. And yes, I always say I'm so grateful she was born in 2007 and not 1987. It's 10 times better. But it's a rough road, and it is a gut punch. You know, I got the gut punch twice at birth, and then I got the gut punch with an autism diagnosis 3 years ago, and it is constant. So,
Yeah, we all know that. Yes.
this kind of comes off of what you're saying. So my question is, how are we preparing educators in the classroom when they're studying in the College of Education to help the 34.5% that are sitting in the classroom, in their classroom? Because I know that we specialize, right, with special needs education. So you either go that route or you go your general ed route. How are we making that move in the School of Education so that we can show all this specialization?
that's literally one of my dream projects. I call it tearing down the wall. So we have a wall between gen ed and SPED, and it exists at the school, the district, the state department, ever. But that wall is built in the College of Ed. What do we ask these burgeoning teachers? The first decision they have to make is whether I'm going to teach these kids or those kids. Most of them choose these kids, and then they're shocked to find out that the majority, that they've got kids with, and they go, oh, well, those aren't my kids. They need to go down to the resource room. So I am completely with you, and I'm actually working on a project where I did a side-by-side of the teacher standards in our state for SPED certificates and gen ed certificates, and guess what? They're 90% the same. Because, and here's a fun statistic for you, and it's true nationally, but in Arizona, 67% of all kids with IEPs spend all of their day in a gen ed classroom. That shocks people, again, because they're thinking of these kids and not those kids. So you're asking absolutely the right question, but I fear that we're not even starting to tackle that yet.
All right. Yes, sir.
So the question is, how do we get volunteers to help change the world? So that's the question. But if you'll bear with me, I'll give you a 90-second reason for that. I'm a volunteer with youth under the Social Entrepreneur Program. I did a grade 3 class, grade 4-5 class, a grade 8 class, and a grade 2 class. Girl said, Mr. Georgopoulos, here's my business plan. Grade 2, it was typed. This year I went and worked with an inclusion class. So Kara, what is an inclusion class? I really can't explain it. Or Karla, there were kids all over the spectrum. I have become a better human being. I'm an advocate for teachers and special ed, et cetera. So, and the school board that I volunteer at uses people or taps onto people like me. So how can each one of you use volunteers to help you in your missions? So I'm glad I asked the question.
So the question is, do people in this field use volunteers, and how are they recruited?
I'll go real quickly. But I think that I've actually been involved with an organization that literally does that. It recruits oftentimes parents that have had a child with that has gone through the special education system and all the and all the factors, and actually matches parents with younger parents that might be going through that for the first time. But I think part of the reason why there's a need for that, though, is kind of pathetic. Like, we make this, like Karla was saying, it is ridiculously and unreasonably hard for parents to get the resources and identification of what their kids' needs are. And I don't know. I think part of the reason for that is the primary provider of these services is the government, and the government's uniquely bad at specialization. It just is.
So we do use volunteers. We spend a lot of time connecting with a lot of different individuals in the community, a lot of different businesses that can provide, whether it's services to different people in the community, not necessarily to our kiddos. So we have volunteers come in and help support in different ways. It may not be with the students specifically, but supporting with helping us with resources or trainings, or we develop a lot of the curriculum ourselves. We develop a lot of the training ourselves. And so we do use our community volunteers, but it is hard to access volunteers. We don't want to access our parents all the time. Our parents, like you said, are advocating for their child 24/7, 365 days a year, and they're tired. And so we don't ask them to do fundraisers. We don't ask them for money other than for tuition, and we don't ask them to come in and volunteer their time or require 20 hours a year to volunteer their time. But we do put a lot on our community partners, and we ask them to come in and spend some time in our schools to understand what we're doing and what our students need, and just a sort of exposure of, once you connect and you get to know our students and you see what they're capable of, then a lot of them are willing to open their doors to employment for people with autism. And as they get older, that's sort of where we focus a lot of our volunteer efforts, are just those connections in the community to have them see, like, they are capable and this is possible. And with the right supports in any place, you're able to help them have that meaning and that purpose to do a job that they love, that they're contributing back to the community, and then the community supporting them. So that's where we really focus our volunteer efforts, but honestly, we try to not access our parents as much because they're tired and they're working hard and they don't ever get time off from advocating for their child.
Okay, yes, over there.
So I think COVID was kind of an interesting time as almost like a bringing of consciousness of these problems. You kind of see as the standard parent that might not feel like they have a child that has a special need, they kind of see the diverging needs of kids. And so, as someone that's an outsider to this personally, I want to hear from your perspectives how COVID and the preceding years have changed, if at all, your philosophies toward how you approach this problem.
I have another unpopular message. I think we dramatically underdiagnose. And I think that became really clear. And my daughter's autism diagnosis, it's still hard for me to talk, but came out of COVID because she was home and I saw all kinds of stuff. Because we did see things more than we had before, I don't think we have scratched the surface yet of the post-COVID realities, even like the speech language impairments of the kids 0 through 2 who had to live through masks and didn't have those language models. I don't think we've scratched the surface. The numbers are increasing. There was just the new federal numbers came out just I think a month ago, and nationally the numbers are creeping up. Unfortunately, of course, autism continues to grow as a proportion as well. But again, when can we get to a place where we just start designing for all kids rather than considering our kids outliers? And that's the dream, and it's a lofty dream, and I had hopes that was going to come out of COVID, and unfortunately I'm getting a little pessimistic on that route.
I just want to comment on that because I've observed that COVID created an employment issue in a lot of places, and it became easier for teenagers to find jobs, and it became easier for disabled people or people perceived as unable to work to get jobs, because it turns out that they were more dependable employees. If they got a job, they'd stick with it. And so I've seen, now maybe it's just in the part of the country where I live, but I've seen a much more openness to incorporating people with some limitations to realize, okay, they can do something. Yeah, we can find a place for them. So I'm going to ask the panel: is my experience something you've encountered as well?
So I don't know if I could speak with any kind of authority to that, but I think, anecdotally, you definitely see major transitions in I'll just give one example. My attorney has another client who runs a big company, and it's probably an unpopular thing to say here, but during COVID, he sort of observed his sales team was doing pretty well. And he didn't pay for any travel or conferences or conventions, so he just cut it out completely. And so no more conferences, and they were just as productive. So I think a lot of that, so I think that sort of speaks to what you're seeing, that there are industries that have been able to sort of reinvent themselves, relying on remote work and things like that. And some of them do it very well. I think some, depending on the company and depending on the sector, it maybe was a bad experiment. But for many companies, that was not the case, and I think that does at least create more of an ability for people that have trouble transporting themselves to work and so on. And I think that's on balance a very, very good thing. Although we like conferences, so.
I think, especially in higher ed, there's been some studies of how COVID made some accommodations easier to get. Things that were a lot harder, like getting your notes ahead of time, getting things online. So there were some of that. That helped. But, at some point, I want to get to the question of when are we going to improve outcomes? So it's one thing to say, we need to fully fund special ed. We need to make sure that IEPs are perfectly implemented. The fact that only 17% of third graders with an IEP in Arizona are reading at grade level, again, that includes everything from ADD to autism, should be shocking to us, and yet it's not. My school district, 1% of the kids with disabilities are reading on grade level. 1%. So that's, to me, the bigger question, is because without reading, we all know the statistics, how that goes. But that's the question. And I think that's when we start flipping it from being just how do we help kids with disabilities, how do we help kids read? How do we make sure all kids are reading? How do we make sure all kids can do math? And asking that question a little bit differently.
Okay, yes.
I think this, I had the question earlier, but that actually beautifully ties into it. My question is, if we zoom out and look at the Common Core and the state standards across the board, how can we use those to support students with special needs? And I also hate that term, but for ease of saying the question, I guess one of my issues, having been a special ed teacher for 20 years and now running a micro school with personalized education for everyone, because that is the reality of what everyone needs, a lot of times my IEP writing was based on the curriculum that the school was using. And it was really a curriculum disability or an invisible disability that one year the kid didn't have because the teacher was really good at personalizing. The next year was more difficult because so there are so many mismatches happening that number is awful. And what are we using as our diagnoses and assessments, and what are our kind of bigger picture curriculum expectations?
So my team and I this summer worked on a pretty big project where we created something we're calling the ladder system. And we looked at the Florida Best Standards. We took the standards that we felt were the most foundational, that cross grade levels through reading and math, and pulled those standards with modified standards underneath, essentially created our own off of those standards and created a ladder system that will follow our students kindergarten through 12th grade. And what that does is that gives our teachers a starting point and an understanding of what are the most beneficial pieces that we need to teach our children in order to continue to grow on those skills as they go through the grade levels. It also gave us a platform where if I have a student in this kindergarten first grade class and they're moving over to the second, third grade class, what have they mastered so far? And not just looking at 3 goals in an IEP that only tells us 3 sections of what they're doing, but through reading, through math, eventually writing and science, which is what we're creating, we will be able to see what they've mastered and exactly where to pick up after summer to carry on those skills of what they need to learn. And I think the curriculum issue is there is no specific grade 1 curriculum that I have ever found that lends itself, at least to our population, for children with autism to learn from. There are definitely some different curriculum pieces from different ones that have really great pieces to them that I can pull from, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of energy to be able to put that together to create something that teachers can use. But it's worth it, and once it's created, my goal is to be able to take this ladder system and take the curricula that I have looked at and mapped out with these standards or with this ladder system and put that into something that I can share with other special education schools or other schools, period, that have students, because all students can benefit from it, to learn how to teach students that have different needs, that need education in a different way, and to be able to track that, follow it, and then have the curricula like, okay, yes, I can look at Big Ideas Math, and they have some great pieces to it. It's aligned to Florida Best Standards. Here's how we use that in our classrooms to educate our children with autism, and here's what it aligns to in our ladder system to know what standards we're teaching to. So that's something that we've always, even as a special education teacher, I mean, I would get partial curriculum. I'd get the leftovers of second grade or third grade, and then I would be handed a stack of standards that 90% of them weren't even where my students were and didn't lend themselves, and it's overwhelming, and you just shut down, you don't know what to do. So we're trying to change that, and we're definitely starting in our school, but our goal is to take that statewide and start helping schools understand what they need to do to educate our children better.
Okay, in the back.
I think it's also not asking just how do we teach them, but how do they show what they know. I mean, both of my students, that is what their struggle is. My son is gifted, but with executive functioning issues and ADD, it's not just the more time. And same with my daughter. I gave you the spelling example. She could spell words, but she needed flexibility in how she showed it. So I think we have to think about both ends of that.
Well, also, like, I mean, this just highlights, like, I mean, I've experienced this myself with 1 or 2 of my kids, but I don't think people realize how rampant grade inflation is in public schools, in private schools, charter schools. I couldn't care less. So it's really important to, like, again, it just speaks to needs for like standardized assessments. If you want to have an idea of how your kid is doing, unless you're really involved, they can easily fool you, especially if your kid is smart and he may not even realize that he's struggling. And the schools, I'm not saying they're deliberately hiding it, but they definitely don't necessarily have a system that is designed to identify when a kid is struggling. So also, I just want to say, just because I know we've had experience in Ohio with this recently, besides like state standards, like we've just spent a ton of money and implementing a law related to the science of reading. I mean, that's like that. We'll see what the results are. But if you're not doing that, what do you think is going to happen to a kid with dyslexia? It's not. There's no way that they're going to be able to get to where they need to be. In our flagship university, talking about teacher prep programs before, our flagship university was one of the biggest national pushers of curriculum that was, scientifically flawed, together with our friends at Columbia. So definitely something that needs to be, and 40% of our districts were using curriculum that was not aligned to the science of reading, right? So there's obviously more to fix than just that, but like to me, that just seems super obvious. And so hopefully we'll start getting it right.
All right, in the back.
I want to go back to your idea of changing the world. And part of my question deals with the different terminologies we're using, like students with disabilities, special education, special needs, neurodiversity. Is there a place that one of these is better than another, or are they all the same? Or talk to me about those distinctions, if you would.
Well, this is
How
the
that
world
might
of
impact
political
how we're
correctness.
approaching things.
My child was first handicapped, and then he was disabled, and now he's differentially abled. And yeah, this is
Is it just terminology, or are there subtle differences that we want to help influence the way people look at one another?
All right, well, let's see what the panel has to say about that. What's the right language?
If you can't tell by my inability to hold back my tears, we are a sensitive lot. So, I mean, I can cry at the drop of a hat. So there is some of that. And it honestly took me some time to be comfortable saying she has a disability. And it's been even harder for me to embrace autism, quite frankly. But it's who she is. So yeah, I mean, there's just the change in language and time and, MR to ID and all that other stuff. So there isn't always the best. My pet peeve with special needs is it's not defined. I don't know who that is. It's just a little bit too broad. But again, that's because I'm a policy person, so I need specificity in law. But I think, and there's also this idea of people first. I don't know if you've heard that term. But I cannot tell you, and when I first heard that term, I thought, why are people being so sensitive? Until I have, and still to this day, oh, she's a Downs baby? No, she's a child with Down syndrome. And they're like, oh, did I say something different? And I said, yeah, you would never refer to me as the breast cancer lady. You would never call my dad the Alzheimer's guy, so then they go, oh, I get it. So I think part of it is just being sensitive. But again, we are an oversensitive lot. I will readily admit that.
I think obviously I'm going to speak specifically about the autism community, and I definitely cannot speak for everybody, but in my conversations with adults, actually my own employees that I have that are on the spectrum, they have said to me that they don't want people first. They don't want a person with autism. I'm autistic. I'm an autistic adult. So we respect that. I always use the people first language and say children with autism because it's kind of what's ingrained in me just from my time of when I grew up and, what I've been exposed to. But many conversations I have and even books I've read by autistic adults want just autistic adults. So I think it just depends on your audience and who you're speaking with and sort of what they want to go by. And, we teach our kids to advocate for what they want and to specify in the beginning of a conversation if that's what they want a person to say. And some of our students are capable of that and some of our students aren't. But we do use people first language, and I push that with my staff, but with some of my staff that are on the spectrum and they want autistic adults or autistic, that's what we use for them. So I think it depends on the audience.
I think the reason that term resonates with me is because, again, I'm gonna cry again. I don't want you to look at my daughter and say, oh, she has Down syndrome. I want you to look at her and say, she's beautiful. Wow, she's a great cheerleader. She's amazing. That's what I want to hear. I don't want you to see that first. So that's just my perspective.
Also, I think it's also important to keep in mind, like even in the context of like my sister-in-law happens to have Down syndrome, and she's brilliant. Like she does not need an IEP. She, with 0 accommodations, had a B+ average in high school. Like so like even within, like again, people are just so different. Just because someone has Down syndrome, they still have all kinds of possibilities, right? So I don't know. I would just keep that in mind.
All right, so we're running out of time. We're over time. So I'm going to say thank you very much for all these good questions, and thanks to our panel.